February 19th, 1943, Kasserine Pass, 0640 hours. The first shells came in low and fast, ripping into the rocky slopes above the pass and showering the American foxholes with shards of stone men who had been shivering in the pre-dawn cold threw themselves deeper into the earth, pressing their faces into dust that still smelled unfamiliar. North Africa's thin winter light was just beginning to creep over the ridges when the horizon to the east started to flash, one orange bloom after another, as German guns walked their fire down the gullies that led into Kasserine radios crackled with half-heard orders. Trucks ground their gears in reverse. Somewhere behind the line, an engine that wouldn't start coughed and died. As the barrage grew closer, Private Joe Ramirez had never heard anything like it. Back home in New Mexico, thunder came with rain. Here the sky stayed hard and blue while the sound rolled over the mountains like metal being torn apart. He clutched his rifle and tried to remember the lectures about German tactics, about panzers probing gaps, about holding fire until they could see the enemy clearly. But the pass in front of him was empty. Just rock, scrub, and dust. The enemy existed only as sound and vibration, and the occasional glint of sunlight on something moving far down the valley behind him, on a ridge scraped into a command post. British and American officers bent over a map that looked too neat for the chaos around them. A line of coloured pencils marked where units were supposed to be. Another line, drawn later and more hastily, showed where they actually were. Between those lines, confusion lived. Major General Lloyd Fredendall's American Second Corps sat where he had ordered them, spread out, dug in piecemeal, their positions difficult to support. Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson's British First Army tried to control a front that twisted through mountains. The telephone wires between them hummed with clipped phrases and rising irritation. It should have been a moment of unity. The Afrika Korps was on the move again, and everyone knew the man leading it. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had slipped away from the British Eighth Army in the east and turned west. His armoured spearhead now probed toward the American lines, hungry for weakness, eager to punish inexperience. For the Allies, Kasserine was supposed to be a test, a sharp lesson that would harden the new American troops and show they could stand beside their British partners. But on the morning the shells fell, the test felt more like an ambush of their own making. Ramirez heard the first tank before he saw it. A deep, grinding growl rose from the valley floor, louder than any truck. He peered over the lip of his foxhole and saw dust boiling up from a bend in the wadi. Then the turret appeared, then the hull, a German Panzer IV, its gun already elevated, its tracks chewing a path toward the pass. Behind it came more shapes, some German, some Italian, all moving with a confidence that made his stomach twist. For a moment he froze, waiting for someone, somewhere, to shout a clear order that would make sense of the chaos. Up on the ridge, the argument had already started. Anderson wanted to pull certain units back to trade ground for a tighter, more defensible line. Fredendall insisted his positions were adequate, that the enemy would be blunted where the map said they would be. Their staff officers spoke in tones that tried to sound calm, but the friction was obvious even to the signal sergeant holding the field phone. They were watching the valley, listening to the same guns, but they did not see the same battle. Down in the dust of Kasserine Pass, Joe Ramirez and thousands like him would pay for that disagreement long before anyone wrote it into a report. The expectations leading into Kasserine Pass were shaped less by reality than by pride, habit, and the weight of two very different command cultures forced to overlap. Long before the first German shells fell, before the dust rose from the valley floor under the tracks of Rommel's panzers, American and British commanders had already envisioned how the battle would unfold. Each side had its own assumptions, and none aligned with what waited in the ridges and wadis of western Tunisia. For the Americans of Second Corps, this was supposed to be their real introduction to large-scale desert fighting. Many of the officers had read about Rommel, studied his manoeuvres, and listened to British accounts of battles stretching back to Tobruk and Gazala. But the US Army entered North Africa with a mixture of confidence and inexperience. They expected to hold a static defensive line. They expected clear orders from above, tidy instructions and support that arrived on schedule. They expected the Germans to behave predictably, probe the line, test the defences, and break off if resistance was firm. General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2 corps from a headquarters dug absurdly far behind the front, believed his dispersed defensive layout made sense. On his maps, units spread out across the mountains seemed flexible and protected. Behind sandbagged walls, he told his staff that the Germans could be stopped at the passes long enough to counterattack later. His expectation was simple: hold the ground where it lay, no retreat, no compression of the line, no shifting of forces unless he ordered it. Everything in Fredendall's mind depended on digging in and staying put. The British First Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, saw the situation differently. They had already fought Rommel for 2 years. They expected fluid battlefields, rapid flanking moves, and sudden changes in momentum. To Anderson and his senior officers, 2 corps positions looked stretched thin, their units too far apart to support one another, their commanders too new to anticipate what the Desert Fox could improvise. Anderson expected a hard blow, maybe even a forced withdrawal, but he believed the Americans needed that test. Expecting them to stand firm without battlefield experience felt unrealistic. Expecting them to regroup under pressure felt necessary. Both leaders expected authority to flow cleanly. It didn't. Both expected the other to adjust. Neither did. Their assumptions hardened into friction, and that friction shaped every decision around Kasserine long before the first artillery round struck the slopes. The German expectation was sharper, colder, and rooted in hard-earned instincts. Rommel did not expect the Americans to crumble instantly, but he expected them to hesitate, long enough for him to exploit their reactions. He saw Second Corps not as an immovable wall, but as a series of weakly connected islands. He expected gap after gap. He expected confusion in the Allied chain of command. He expected to break through before the British could intervene. And above all, he expected speed to become his greatest weapon. American troops on the ground had expectations of their own, shaped by rumours and campfire conversations rather than strategy. Many believed Rommel was nearly mythic, a commander with supernatural instincts. Others believed he was exhausted, running on limited fuel and outdated panzers. They expected the British to coordinate everything. After all, the British had been fighting in North Africa for years. They expected support to appear when needed. They expected the ridge positions drawn on their maps to be inherently strong, even if few had actually walked the ground. In the foxholes at Kasserine, young privates like Joe Ramirez expected a fight, but they expected one that made sense. They did not expect a sudden, disjointed flood of conflicting orders. They did not expect armour to appear in places their officers had said were impossible. They did not expect to feel so alone the moment the first tank silhouette appeared in the distant dust. All these expectations, American, British, German, clashed violently with the terrain. Kasserine Pass was not a neat battlefield. It was a twisting funnel of rock, narrow wadis, blind corners, and steep ridges that hid entire armoured columns until the moment they burst into sight. British staff officers assumed the Americans understood this. American commanders assumed the British would guide them through it. German planners assumed no one would coordinate fast enough to stop them. The pass itself had no expectations. It simply channeled everything, infantry, armour, fear, radios crackling under stress, into its narrow throat. As the sun rose on February 19th, every line on every map started to unravel. Units expected to support each other found themselves isolated. Defensive positions expected to hold crumbled under enfilade fire from angles no one had scouted. Tanks expected to be in reserve were suddenly needed on the front, and the 2 generals whose cooperation mattered most, Fredendall and Anderson, expected the other to fix the unfolding disaster first. But in war, expectation is a luxury. Reality arrives with dust, noise, and steel, and at Kasserine reality was coming fast. The battle that unfolded at Kasserine Pass did not match the expectations held by either side, and the contradictions between what commanders believed and what the battlefield delivered grew sharper with every passing hour. As the shells fell and the dust clouds thickened, the gulf between planning and reality widened until it became impossible to ignore. The contradictions were not subtle, they were violent, unmistakable ruptures between generals and ground truth, between orders and terrain, between confidence and shock. The first contradiction emerged in the simplest form. The Americans were not positioned where Fredendall believed they were. On his maps, drawn from a headquarters dug into the mountains many miles back, lines of defence looked neatly arranged across hills and choke points. In reality, units were scattered across ridges that barely overlooked the approaches, companies held gaps too wide to control, and battalions sat too far apart to reinforce each other. Fredendall assumed they had depth. They had none. He assumed they had fields of fire. They had blind spots. He assumed they could stop armour in the pass. They couldn't even see the armour until it was almost upon them. Anderson, who had expected a tough fight, nevertheless assumed the Americans had shaped their positions with more care. British doctrine emphasised reconnaissance, overlapping fire, and mobility. Yet when Anderson's liaison officers moved through the pass the day before the attack, they found trenches dug in the wrong places, machine guns pointed toward empty slopes, and roadblocks that could be bypassed with a modest detour. The contradiction between experience and reality made Anderson anxious, but by the time that anxiety reached Fredendall, it was diluted into polite suggestions Fredendall largely ignored. The second contradiction came from the Germans themselves. Allied leaders knew Rommel was short on fuel, short on experienced tank crews, short on nearly everything, yet the attack that came up the pass moved with a confidence and coordination that defied those shortages. German armoured cars scouted the approaches with surgical precision. Panzer IVs advanced not as a desperate force but as a disciplined vanguard, probing weaknesses with the finesse of a surgeon testing for pain. Italian troops supporting the German armoured group moved with unexpected aggressiveness, pushing through wedges the Allies had dismissed as impassable. American troops had expected scattered enemy units still recovering from battles farther east. Instead, they faced the concentrated will of a commander who sensed opportunity and was determined to exploit it with every ounce of strength he had left. The third contradiction was deadlier still. American units that expected clear, steady orders received confusion instead. Radios buzzed with overlapping voices. Some officers shouted to hold positions no longer defensible. Others ordered withdrawals based on assumptions Fredendall made from his bunker far to the rear. Platoons abandoned ground not because they wanted to retreat, but because the instructions flowing downward contradicted each other so thoroughly that no one could tell which order took precedence. Joe Ramirez experienced it firsthand. One sergeant screamed at his squad to dig in deeper. Another told them to fall back to a ridge he couldn't see. A lieutenant ran past, shouting for all units to regroup at a road junction that had already fallen. Ramirez looked around and saw fear tightening the faces of men who had never expected their first real battle to feel so directionless. The contradiction between training and combat was brutal. They had prepared for clear threats, clear plans, clear leadership. Instead, the battlefield shook under German artillery while every order seemed to dissolve into dust. Rommel's attack offered its own contradictions. He had expected stiff resistance at certain points, only to find gaps he hadn't dared hope for. He had expected American tanks to counterattack aggressively, but many sat immobilized by orders that never reached them in time. His staff officers expected fuel shortages to halt progress, yet captured American supplies provided temporary reprieve. Even for the Desert Fox, the battle unfolded in ways he had not fully anticipated, but the contradictions favoured him far more than the Allies. The fourth contradiction came in the form of Allied cooperation. Anderson assumed Fredendall would reposition forces when weak spots emerged. Fredendall assumed Anderson would handle strategic adjustments. Neither was wrong in theory, but both were wrong in practice. The line between their commands ran through terrain where communication wires were frequently cut by shelling, where courier jeeps could be ambushed by German patrols, where units needed local decisions, not distant debates. Cooperation existed on paper. On the ground, it fractured. The fifth contradiction was emotional. American soldiers who had entered the theatre with confidence, armed with new tanks, new weapons, and fresh enthusiasm, now faced the chaos of defeat. The contradiction between the pride they had carried ashore and the panic unfolding in the pass hit them like a physical blow. Men who expected to prove themselves suddenly struggled to simply survive the morning. Kasserine Pass became a battlefield defined not by strengths or weaknesses alone, but by the contradictions that tore apart Allied planning expectations, collided with reality at every turn, creating a vortex of confusion the Germans exploited with precision. The question now was not whether the contradictions existed. They were everywhere. The question was whether anyone could fix them before the Afrika Korps drove straight through the pass and tore two corps apart. The escalation at Kasserine Pass could be measured in numbers that grew heavier, harsher, and more impossible with every hour. The battle did not simply intensify, it expanded like a storm front rolling through mountains, swallowing units whole. The deeper Rommel pushed, the more the imbalance became visible in raw metrics of men, guns, tanks, and miles lost. The numbers were not abstract, they were alive. They dictated the pace of collapse and the rhythm of resistance, and they exposed just how unprepared the Allied command structure was for a coordinated assault. The first number that mattered was distance, the physical gap between Fredendall and his frontline units. While Donnelly in previous stories fought enemies in the sky, here the problem was below ground, in bunkers and foxholes separated by 15, 20, even 30 miles of impossible terrain. Fredendall's headquarters sat in a dugout so fortified and so distant that his only view of the battlefield came from field telephones and second-hand reports. He believed he could direct the battle with maps alone, but the miles between him and the fighting created a void where confusion thrived. Orders took too long to reach units, and when they did, the situation on the ground had already changed. Next came the number of gaps in the Allied line. What looked like a neat arrangement on a staff map became a patchwork of empty space once the shells began to fall. Entire battalions were separated by several kilometres, with ridges, gullies, and blind turns between them. These gaps, initially written off as acceptable risk, became corridors through which German reconnaissance cars slipped effortlessly. Every hour, more dust clouds appeared on the flanks of American positions as Axis units probed the seams. The numbers told a simple truth: too many holes, not enough troops. Then came the artillery imbalance. The Germans committed more than a dozen batteries to the attack, hammering each ridge with methodical precision. The Americans responded with what they had, but many of their guns sat too far to the rear to fire effectively into the pass. Worse, communication breakdowns left some batteries unaware of where friendly units were retreating. The German guns fired thousands of shells over the first day. American counter-battery fire was sporadic, sometimes misdirected, often too late. The ratio tilted heavily toward the attackers, another number that shaped the outcome. Armour escalated next. Rommel pushed roughly 50 to 60 operational tanks into the valley, Panzer IIIs and IVs, along with Italian Semovente assault guns. The Americans, on paper, possessed enough tanks to match or overwhelm this number, but many were held in reserve, scattered, or stuck behind bottlenecks created by narrow tracks that clogged instantly with retreating vehicles. In practice, the ratio of tanks actually available at the point of contact was painfully lopsided. German armour struck in concentrated spearheads. American armour arrived in dribs and drabs, often too late or without infantry support. The numerical difference may have been small, but the effective difference was enormous. Manpower escalated in uneven waves. While the Americans had tens of thousands in the broader sector, only fragments of regiments actually held the pass at any one time, and these fragments were often isolated by terrain. The Germans, though fewer overall, applied their manpower with ruthless precision, pushing infantry to exploit openings, sending engineers to clear mines, and using motorcycle troops to cut communication lines. The number of American units fighting without clear orders grew by the hour, while the number of German units finding tactical freedom followed the same trajectory. Retreat distances added their own cruel arithmetic. A company falling back 1 kilometre created a gap that left a battalion vulnerable. A battalion retreating 3 kilometres left an entire flank open. The retreats multiplied like a chain reaction, maps filled with arrows that curved westward, then southwest, then west again. Instead of compressing into a coherent line, the Allies staggered backward in uneven chunks. Every withdrawal compounded the next. The number of miles lost climbed far faster than any countermeasure could keep up. Fuel shortages and supply missteps added more weight to the escalation. American trucks overloaded with wounded and retreating troops, clogged roads meant for reinforcements. Tanks ran low on fuel as they repositioned repeatedly, following contradictory orders. Ammunition dumps were abandoned when positions collapsed too quickly. The numbers were brutal, fuel loads dropping, ammo counts shrinking, trucks stacking in choke points, casualties rising. By mid-afternoon, the numbers told a story no officer wanted to articulate. The Germans were advancing with a tempo that outpaced every Allied attempt to respond to American losses, mounted in double digits, then triple digits, dead, wounded, missing, captured. Entire platoons vanished into the chaos. German columns advanced several kilometres by evening, holding ground the Allies had expected to defend for days, the battle had escalated beyond plans, beyond expectations, beyond any single commander's control. And the numbers, unyielding, unforgiving, showed just how quickly the Afrika Korps was tearing through the heart of II Corps. For the men on the ground at Kasserine Pass, the battle was not a clash of strategy or command. It was a series of personal moments, moments filled with fear, grit, and the feeling of being swept into something far bigger than anything their training had prepared them for. Maps and orders meant little inside the dust and noise. What mattered was staying alive long enough to make sense of the chaos. Private Joe Ramirez felt that truth the moment the first shell struck the slopes. The ground shook beneath him, rattling the loose stones he had piled around his foxhole. He pressed his face into the dust and tried to slow his breathing. Back at the training camps, instructors always talked about courage. Here, courage meant staying in place while every instinct begged him to run. He gripped his rifle, not because he expected to use it immediately, but because it anchored him to something familiar in a desert that suddenly felt hostile in every direction. A few hundred yards away, Corporal Henry Moore fought his own battle. His machine gun team had practiced dozens of times, but nothing had prepared them for clearing jams while artillery screams drowned out every command. The weapon choked twice in 10 minutes from dust kicked up by explosions. Moore's assistant gunner trembled so badly he dropped a belt of ammunition. Moore didn't yell. He simply grabbed the belt, shoved it into place, and told the young man to breathe. The desert had a way of aging soldiers faster than years ever could. Medics carried the worst burden. Sergeant Tom Whitaker sprinted through swirling dust and falling shells, moving from casualty to casualty with his canvas bag slung across his shoulder. The bag grew lighter, faster than he liked. Bandages disappeared. Morphine syringes dwindled. Water ran out. He had worked in a hospital before the war, but nothing in Detroit resembled treating wounds while tanks rumbled somewhere beyond the ridgeline and machine gun fire cracked along the rocks. Lieutenants, the men expected to bring order, struggled too. Lieutenant Charles Berman tried to lead his platoon while his radio spat static, more often than real instructions. One message told him to hold the ridge. Another told him to pull back. Another insisted he counterattack immediately. None matched the situation in front of him. His men looked at him with wide, questioning eyes, hoping for clarity. All he could offer was steadiness, real or not. Fear showed itself differently in each soldier. One man whispered prayers under his breath between bursts of fire. Another stared at the dust on his boots as if the answer to survival were printed in the dirt. A third kept touching a letter from home folded inside his pocket. None of them had expected their first real battle to feel like being swallowed by confusion, but even inside that fear, moments of quiet courage appeared. Ramirez crawled out of his foxhole to drag a wounded man into cover when no one else could reach him. Moore's young assistant gunner steadied his shaking hands long enough to feed another ammunition belt. Whitaker stayed beside a badly wounded soldier until another medic arrived, refusing to leave even as shells burst uncomfortably close. The human side of Kasserine was not defined by flawless discipline. It was defined by men doing the best they could with what little stability they had. They were green, under-supported and scattered, but they stayed in the fight because the alternative, letting the pass fall without resistance, felt worse than fear. In those moments, the American line held not because of grand strategy, but because frightened soldiers found the courage to fight one more minute at a time. The turning point at Kasserine Pass did not arrive with a dramatic charge or sudden heroics. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, through a series of realizations, moments when American soldiers and commanders alike understood that the battle unfolding around them could not be saved by holding their ground. It had to be saved by changing it. The first sign came when German armoured cars slipped through a gap no one believed was large enough for vehicles. Ramirez heard the message passed down the line in fragments. Armour in the rear, armoured cars behind us, Germans on the western slope. At first he thought someone had misheard. The pass was supposed to funnel the enemy. Instead, the enemy had flowed around it. That realization spread faster than any order. It was the moment the men in the foxholes understood the terrain they thought protected them had become a trap. Corporal Henry Moore saw the turning point differently. From his machine gun nest he watched German infantry appear, where no infantry should have been, moving along a ridgeline his platoon sergeant had called too steep to climb. But the enemy was climbing, picking their way through rock and scrub with the patience of mountaineers. Moore realised then that the Germans were not attacking the positions the Americans had built. They were attacking the assumptions those positions were built upon. Lieutenant Berman felt the turning point through his radio. Messages that had once contradicted each other went silent. Then new orders came, sharp and urgent. Pull back from the ridge, regroup on the road, form a new line at the junction. For the first time all morning, Berman heard something that sounded like clarity. Someone up the chain, Anderson's staff perhaps, had recognised the collapse forming and decided to reshape the battle instead of clinging to the old plan. Berman didn't like retreating. But he knew that holding the ridge meant dying on the ridge. Higher up, the turning point crystallised when British liaison teams arrived at American positions and saw the situation firsthand. They expected disorganisation, but they did not expect the scale of it. The jammed roads, the scattered units, the lack of coordinated artillery. Their reports moved quickly back to Anderson, who finally realised Fredendall's defensive scheme had unravelled completely. Anderson could not override Fredendall formally, but he could, and did, act around him by redirecting reserves, tightening lines, and pushing for a fighting withdrawal instead of a futile stand. On the German side, Rommel sensed a different turning point. The Americans were weakening too quickly. Instead of encountering steady, disciplined resistance, his units found gaps widening as the day went on. He saw an opportunity to break through entirely, not merely punish Second Corps. But this confidence brought its own shift. Rommel pushed harder, extending his lines more aggressively. His fuel supply ran lower. Some Italian units began lagging behind. The attack gained momentum, but it also stretched thinner. Then came the moment that defined everything. American artillery finally found its rhythm. Batteries that had been slow to respond earlier, now redeployed onto better ground. Communications stabilised just enough for forward observers to guide fire into the wadis, where German infantry advanced. The blasts were not enough to stop the Afrika Korps, but they slowed it. For the first time all day, the Americans imposed a cost on the German advance. That resistance created space, small, fragile, temporary. But it was space the Americans desperately needed. Space to retreat in order, not panic. Space to form a secondary line. Space to breathe. The turning point at Kasserine was not victory. It was a realisation. The Americans could not hold the pass, but they could avoid total collapse. They could learn. They could adapt. They could fight again tomorrow, stronger, angrier, wiser. And that shift, quiet but profound, would reshape not only the battle, but the entire American approach to warfare in North Africa. The aftermath of the fighting at Kasserine Pass settled over the mountains like a heavy, exhausted sigh. When the last bursts of German fire faded and the dust clouds drifted away from the valley floor, what remained was not victory or clarity, but a landscape shaped by confusion and the stubborn will to survive. The Americans had not held the ground. The Afrika Korps had punched through, scattering units and forcing a withdrawal that stretched for miles, yet the battle did not end in the complete destruction Rommel had expected. For soldiers like Ramirez, the aftermath felt surreal. He moved with a column of retreating infantry, boots dragging through the dust, head turning at every distant engine noise. The fear that had gripped him during the worst of the fighting was still there, but dulled by exhaustion. He didn't know how far they were withdrawing. He didn't know where the new line was. He only knew that he was alive, and that the men walking beside him had fought as hard as they could in a battle that had begun stacked against them. Corporal Moore and his machine gun team fell back in tighter shape. They had lost friends on the ridge, men pulled from shell craters or left behind when the Germans flanked them. The silence that followed the retreat was almost painful. Moore kept replaying the moment he realised the enemy was climbing the ridge. An image that would stay with him far longer than the sound of gunfire. Lieutenant Berman found a semblance of order in the aftermath. At the secondary line forming near Thala, he saw British officers directing traffic, American MPs establishing choke points, and artillery crews repositioning with renewed determination. The retreat had been chaotic, but the reorganisation felt purposeful. It was the first sign that the Allies were beginning to learn from the disaster. Rommel's advance slowed as fuel dwindled and resistance stiffened. The Afrika Korps had broken the pass, but it had not broken the II Corps entirely. The aftermath of Kasserine was harsh, but it became the beginning of something else, a hard lesson, paid for in blood, that would transform the American army long before the next battle came. The meaning of Kasserine Pass took shape only after the smoke cleared and the mountains grew quiet again. For days afterward, officers walked the ridgelines, tracing the paths where retreating units had fallen back and where German armour had pressed forward with relentless precision. They saw overturned trucks, abandoned guns, and tracks carved deep into the desert floor, evidence of a battle that had exposed every weakness in the American approach to modern warfare. Kasserine was not simply a defeat, it was a revelation. For the American soldiers who survived, the meaning felt personal. Ramirez understood it when he sat beside a cook fire days later, staring at his mud-caked boots. He realized the battle had stripped away every comfortable illusion he brought with him from training. There was no such thing as a predictable enemy, a perfect line of defense, or a clear set of orders that arrived exactly when they were needed. War demanded adaptation, not assumptions. Courage, he learned, meant facing confusion rather than clarity. The lesson was harsh, but it stayed with him. Corporal Moore felt the meaning in the sharp grief that came from counting the empty places in his machine gun team. Kasserine had shown him how fast a bad position, a late order, or a small mistake could cost lives, but it also taught him that soldiers could endure far more than they believed possible. His fear had not disappeared, it had simply been reshaped into resolve. For the officers, the meaning cut even deeper. Lieutenant Berman understood that command was not about issuing orders. It was about making decisions faster than the chaos could overwhelm them. Kasserine taught him that hesitation was its own form of defeat. Strategically, the meaning became undeniable. The US Army had entered North Africa believing numbers and equipment would be enough. Kasserine revealed the truth. Experience mattered more. Leadership mattered more. Cohesion mattered more. The defeat was painful, but its meaning reshaped an entire army. What emerged from Kasserine was not a broken force, but a force ready to rebuild itself, sharper, humbler, and far more dangerous than before.